He bought the entire building, not one unit, not one floor, the entire building, all 42 apartments, the parking garage, the laundry room in the basement, the rooftop where Mrs. Kim grew her tomatoes, purchased overnight, in cash, without a single warning, and the new rent notices were slipped under every door before sunrise, like a threat dressed up in legal language. Naomi Carter stood in the hallway at 6:14 in the morning, still wearing her sleep bonnet, holding the notice with both hands because one hand wasn't steady enough. Around her, doors were opening. Her neighbor, Mr. Bake, 73 years old, stood in his doorway in slippers, squinting at the same paper. Across the hall, the young mother with the twin girls was already crying. Not the quiet kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and tired. Triple the rent. 60 days to comply or vacate. Naomi knew exactly one person in this city capable of doing something like this. And she had quit working for him 11 days ago, Kim. If you've ever walked away from something that scared you, a job, a relationship, a situation that felt wrong in your bones, even when you couldn't explain why, then you already understand Naomi Carter better than she understood herself. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is leave. And sometimes leaving is the thing that starts the real danger. This is her story. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us until the very end, because this story is going to take you somewhere you did not expect. Drop a like and leave a comment with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The 2 a.m. call came on a Tuesday. Naomi remembered it the way you remember a car accident, not as a sequence of events, but as a single frozen image. Her phone on the nightstand, the screen lighting up the ceiling, the unfamiliar number. And then the voice on the other end, low and precise, rattling off a 16-digit authorization code and telling her to approve a fund transfer of $4.7 million by 3 a.m., or the accounts would be flagged and frozen. She had sat up in bed with her heart doing something uncomfortable behind her ribs. "I'm sorry," she had said. "Who is this?" The man on the phone didn't answer that. He just repeated the authorization code and the deadline. Naomi had been the executive secretary at KT Logistics for 3 years. She had approved financial documents before: vendors, contractors, freight invoices, the kind of paperwork that crosses a secretary's desk when the boss trusts her enough to handle operational details. She was good at her job, better than good. She had a system for everything: color-coded folders, a filing protocol that could survive a power outage, a calendar management style that had once prompted Kang Tae-hyuk himself to look up from a briefing and say, without any warmth but with something that passed for acknowledgement, "You're the only person in this building who understands how time works." That was the closest thing to a compliment she'd ever gotten from him in 3 years. She had approved the transfer. She'd entered the code, clicked confirm, and gone back to sleep telling herself it was just an unusual vendor payment and she'd file the paperwork in the morning. In the morning, she started pulling the paperwork. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. It was the thing that made her good at her job and occasionally annoying at dinner parties. She cross-referenced the account number from the transfer against the vendor directory. Then she cross-referenced it against the subsidiary ledger. Then against the tax ID database she maintained for compliance purposes. The account didn't exist in any of them. She'd sat very still at her desk for approximately 45 seconds. Then she'd pulled the last 6 months of similar late-night transfers. There were 11 of them. 11 transfers, all between midnight and 4 a.m., all authorized under her credentials, all routed to accounts that weren't in any legitimate company record she could find. The total was somewhere north of $30 million. Naomi had closed the files. She had straightened her desk. She had walked to the executive floor bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the closed toilet seat for 4 minutes, breathing through her nose, the way her mother had taught her when she was a child prone to panic. Then she walked to Kang Tae-hyuk's office and resigned. She had expected him to be difficult. He was always difficult. Kang Tae-hyuk operated on a frequency that most people couldn't access, cold where others were warm, still where others flinched, and capable of a silence so heavy it had weight. He was 38 years old and looked like someone had carved him specifically to intimidate. Not because of his height or his clothes or the way his security team moved around him like water around a stone, but because of his eyes. He had the kind of eyes that made you feel like he was already 3 steps ahead of whatever you were about to say and had already decided it wasn't going to change anything. Naomi had never been particularly intimidated by him. This was either a personal strength or a character flaw. She'd never decided which. She placed her resignation letter on his desk at 9:17 in the morning. He was in the middle of reading something, and he didn't look up right away. "I'm resigning," she said, because she wasn't going to stand there silently waiting for him to finish whatever he was reading. "Effective immediately. The transition documents are ready, the calendar is updated through end of month, and my access codes are in the envelope." He looked up then. Not with surprise. Taehyuk didn't do surprise, but with the particular quality of attention he gave things that were suddenly requiring more processing than he'd allocated. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." "I wasn't asking." Naomi sat. She did it the way she did most things, a little inelegantly, her bag catching on the chair arm, her coffee thermos nearly tipping before she caught it. She was not a graceful person. She had made her peace with that somewhere around age 25. "You've been here 3 years, Taehyuk said. "Yes." "You've never been late. You've never missed a filing deadline. You predicted the Incheon contract dispute 2 weeks before legal did." "Thank you." That wasn't a compliment. That was context. He set down what he was reading. "What do you want?" "I want to resign." "Everyone wants something before they resign. Name it." Naomi looked at him. She had spent 3 years sitting across from this man in briefings and conference calls, and the occasional working dinner that ran until midnight. She knew his tells, the way his jaw tightened when he was annoyed, the way his fingers went still when he was thinking hard, the specific quality of his silence when he'd already made a decision and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. She also knew, sitting across from him now, that she could not tell him she'd found the transfers. She didn't know why. Some instinct she didn't fully understand. The same instinct that had made her lock the bathroom door before she let herself react. "I want an ordinary life," she said. "I want to go to work at a normal job where nobody calls me at 2 in the morning. I want to come home and watch television and not think about whether I've missed something important. I want ordinary." "I'll double your salary." "No." "Fewer hours. You leave at 5 every day. No exceptions." "No." "You can refuse any assignment. No questions, no consequences." "Mr. Kang." She picked up her bag. "I appreciate the offers, but I've already decided." He didn't say anything else. He looked at her with those still, assessing eyes. And then he nodded once, which from him was practically a speech. She got up and walked out. She didn't realize until she was in the elevator that her hands were shaking. The next 11 days were the closest thing to peace she'd had in years. She slept until 7. She cooked actual meals instead of eating whatever the office kitchen had left over at 8 p.m. She called her mother in Atlanta and talked for an hour without keeping one eye on her inbox. She went to the farmer's market on Saturday morning and bought more vegetables than one person could reasonably consume and felt absolutely no guilt about it. She was starting to believe she'd made the right call. She was starting to believe the transfers were someone else's problem now. She was wrong on both counts. The morning the rent notices appeared, Naomi spent 40 minutes in her apartment trying to talk herself down from what she was feeling. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table. She read the notice 3 more times, hoping the number would change. It didn't. She could hear Mrs. Kim in the hallway, talking to someone in a mixture of Korean and English, her voice doing that particular wobbling thing that older women's voices did when they were trying very hard not to cry in public. Mrs. Kim was 71. She had lived in this building for 9 years. Her late husband had proposed to her in the courtyard. Naomi finished her tea. She put on clothes. She did not bother with her usual careful routine of making sure everything matched, and her natural hair was properly contained. She walked out of her apartment looking exactly like what she was, a woman who had run out of the particular patience required to be presentable when she was furious. She took the subway to the KT Logistics building. She didn't have a badge anymore. She had to wait at the security desk in the lobby while the guard called upstairs, which gave her approximately 6 minutes to stand there with her arms crossed and her jaw set, watching the guard's face go through a small range of expressions that suggested whoever he was talking to upstairs was having a more complicated reaction than a simple yes or no. He came back to the desk. "Mr. Kang says you can go up." "Of course he did," Naomi said. She rode the elevator to the 44th floor. The executive assistant at the outer desk, a new one, young, with the specific look of someone who had been briefed about Naomi without being told the full story, started to say something about scheduling. Naomi walked past her. She had spent 3 years learning which doors in this building she could open without knocking and which ones required ceremony, and the door to Taehyuk's private office had stopped requiring ceremony somewhere around the end of her first year. She pushed it open. He was at his desk. Standing, actually, which was unusual. He was on a call, speaking in rapid Korean into his earpiece, and when he looked up and saw her, his expression did something complicated that lasted about half a second before it locked back into neutral. He said something into the earpiece. Ended the call. "You bought my building," Naomi said. She was not going to walk further into the room because if she got any closer to him, she wasn't sure what volume level her voice would reach, and she still had some professional dignity to maintain. "You bought my entire building and tripled the rent. 60 days. After I quit. After I specifically told you I wanted an ordinary life." He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked around the desk. "Sit down," he said. "I am so tired of sitting down in this office." "Naomi." His voice was different. Not softer, exactly. Taehyuk didn't do soft. But something in the cadence had changed. Something that made her stop mid-sentence. "Sit down, please." She sat. He didn't go back around the desk. He sat in the chair across from her, the one visitors used, which she had never seen him use before. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, which was not a posture she associated with him at all, and for a moment he just looked at his hands. "I didn't do it to punish you," he said. "Then explain it to me, because from where I'm standing, Han Dojin has had surveillance on you for 6 weeks. The sentence landed like something physical. Naomi felt her mouth close. "He knows who you are," Taehyuk said. "He knows you worked for me. He knows." He stopped. His jaw moved. "He knows you matter to me. That makes you a target, not a theoretical one, a specific, active, immediate one." He looked up at her then. "I found out 4 days after you resigned that he had people watching your building. Not your apartment, your building, exits, entrances, the parking garage. I needed to control every access point, and I needed to do it fast enough that they couldn't position people inside before I could secure it." Naomi stared at him. "The rent increase? Displacement strategy. I needed to be able to move people I trust into key positions in the building. Permanent residents create complications." He said this with the same tone he used for logistics problems, and then he seemed to hear himself because something shifted behind his eyes. "I'm going to fix it. The rent increase. I'm going to make it right for everyone who was affected." Mrs. Kim had her husband propose to her in that courtyard. "I know. She was crying in the hallway this morning." "I know, Naomi." The way he said her name was different from how he'd always said it in meetings and briefings. Less like a designation, more like something he was careful with. "I didn't have a better option. I had about 18 hours to secure the building or pull you out of it entirely, and I couldn't—" He stopped again, looked at his hands again. "I couldn't make that call without knowing if you'd agree to come with me, and I didn't think you would. You could have just told me." "I know. You could have called me and told me there was a threat and asked me what I wanted to do." "I know. Why didn't you?" He was quiet for long enough that the silence started to have texture. "Because I was afraid," he said. "And I was moving faster than I was thinking." Naomi had worked for this man for 3 years. She had seen him negotiate with people who had guns on the table. She had seen him walk into rooms where everyone in them wanted something from him and walk out having given nothing. She had seen him sit through news of catastrophic losses with the expression of someone reviewing a weather forecast. She had never heard him use the word afraid. She sat with that for a moment. Then, "What does Han Dojin want?" "Leverage." Taehyuk leaned back. The brief window of something unguarded in his expression was closing. She could see it happening, the familiar armor reassembling. "I've been blocking his expansion into the northern shipping routes for 2 years. He's decided the fastest way to move me is to find something I value enough to make mistakes over. And he thinks that's me." Taehyuk didn't answer, which was, she had learned, his way of answering. Naomi pressed her lips together. She looked at the window behind him, the Seoul skyline in the morning, gray and enormous and indifferent. She thought about Mrs. Kim's voice in the hallway, about the young mother across the hall with the twin girls, about her own apartment, where she had spent 11 days believing she'd escaped something. "If I go back to work," she said slowly, "temporarily, just until this is handled, what does that look like?" Taehyuk's eyes came back to hers. You'd have full access to intelligence on Han Dojin's operation, your own security detail, your previous salary restored, plus a 20% increase for the elevated risk. He paused. And you'd work directly with me, not through the executive floor structure, directly with me. I want the rent reversed for every tenant in the building, all of them, back to what it was, effective immediately. Done. And I want Mrs. Kim's courtyard fixed. The fountain hasn't worked in 2 years. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. Done. Naomi exhaled. She smoothed her hands over her knees, which was a habit she'd had since childhood, when she was trying to organize her thoughts into something linear. I also found some transfers, she said, and watched his expression change. Late-night transfers from my credentials. 11 of them, 30-something million going to accounts that don't appear in any company records. She looked at him steadily. Someone has been using my access to move money, and I don't think you knew about it. The silence that followed was a different kind than the ones before it. Taehyuk sat very still. His eyes were doing the thing she recognized from the hardest briefings, moving through something internal, processing, connecting. His fingers, resting on the arm of the chair, had gone absolutely motionless. Show me, he said. I printed them, she said, reaching into her bag. I'm very organized. She put the folder on the table between them. He opened it. She watched his face while he read, and what she saw there was not the controlled blankness of a man receiving logistics information. It was the face of a man discovering that the danger he'd been watching from the outside had already been inside for a long time. How long have you had these? He asked. Since the morning I resigned. He looked up at her. I didn't know what they meant, she said. I still don't know what they mean, but I knew they weren't right, and I knew I couldn't put them back and pretend I hadn't seen them. He looked at the folder again. His jaw was tight. Someone in this organization, he said, and stopped. He set the folder down very deliberately, the way people set things down when their hands want to do something else. Someone I trust has been routing money through your credentials, using you as cover. He met her eyes. That means whoever it is knew who you were to me before Han Dojin did. The weight of that sat between them. Outside, Seoul continued doing what it always did, moving, building, indifferent to whatever was burning inside this room. Naomi looked at the man across from her, the feared Mafia Boss who had bought her building in a panic and would not admit it was a panic until the word afraid came out of his mouth. The man who had given her 3 years of cold efficiency and what had apparently been, underneath all of it, a protection she hadn't known she needed. She thought about Ordinary. She thought about the farmer's market and sleeping until 7 and calling her mother. She thought about Mrs. Kim's voice in the hallway. I'm going to need my own desk, she said. Not on the executive floor, somewhere I can work without people watching over my shoulder. Taehyuk nodded. And I want complete access to the financial records. All of them, going back as far as they exist. You'll have it. And if I find something, she stopped, corrected herself. When I find something, you let me handle the documentation. I know how I filed it. I know where the trail is. You don't touch the paper trail until I've mapped it. Agreed. Naomi stood up. She smoothed her skirt. She picked up her bag. I'm going home to change, she said. I'll be back in 2 hours. She walked to the door, reached for the handle. Naomi. She looked back. Kang Taehyuk was still sitting in the visitor's chair, the folder open in front of him. He looked for just a moment like something other than what he usually was. Not weak, not soft. Just real. Human. Someone caring more than the controlled exterior suggested. Thank you, he said, for coming back. Naomi considered this. 3 years of cold acknowledgement, one sentence that actually sounded like it cost him something. Don't thank me yet, she said. We haven't found the leak. She pulled the door open and walked out, her bag catching on the frame on the way through because, of course it did, and she didn't look back, and she didn't let herself think too hard about the word afraid and what it meant that he had said it to her. She had work to do. Somewhere in $30 million of misdirected transfers, someone had made a mistake. And Naomi Carter, clumsy and warm-hearted and relentlessly thorough, was very good at finding mistakes. She always had been. Naomi came back in 2 hours and 4 minutes, which was close enough to what she'd said that nobody commented on it. She was wearing her work clothes now. Dark slacks, a burgundy blouse that her mother had picked out on a video call 6 months ago. Natural hair pinned back in the way she did when she needed to think clearly and didn't want anything in her face. She had her laptop bag over one shoulder and a tote bag over the other, and a coffee in her hand that she'd bought from the cart outside because she wasn't ready to be back inside this building and using this building's coffee. The new executive assistant watched her walk through with the expression of someone who had been given updated instructions but not a full explanation. Naomi didn't stop at the assistant's desk. She went to the conference room on the 43rd floor, not the main one with the long table and the wall screen, but the smaller one at the back that had a single window and a door that locked from the inside. She had booked it under her own name before leaving that morning, logged in through the public portal with the temporary credentials Tae-hyuk had reactivated while she was still in the elevator going down. Efficient. She had always been efficient. It was both her professional value and the thing that had gotten her into this. She set up her laptop. She laid out the printed transfer records in the order she'd found them. She uncapped a pen and put a yellow legal pad on the table because she still thought better on paper, always had, and then she sat down and looked at what she had. 11 transfers. $31.4 million. All routed through her authorization credentials between midnight and 4 a.m. over a period of 7 months. She had caught the last one because it had come with a phone call. A mistake, she now understood. The person running this hadn't needed to call her. Her credentials were already compromised. The call had been either arrogance or desperation, and she hadn't yet decided which. She started mapping. She was 2 hours into it when Tae-hyuk came in without knocking, which didn't surprise her because he knocked on approximately no doors in this building. He had changed into a different suit, same dark color, different cut, which meant he'd had a meeting in between. He had 2 people with him, a man she recognized as head of internal security, a compact Korean man named Director Yoon, who had always looked at her with the specific politeness of someone who didn't understand why she had the access she had, and a woman she didn't recognize, early 40s, carrying a tablet and radiating the particular energy of someone who had been doing high-stakes analytical work long enough that urgency no longer registered on her face. "This is Analyst Park," Tae-hyuk said. "She runs financial forensics." "I know what financial forensics means," Naomi said, not looking up from the legal pad. "Does she know what she's looking at?" "I briefed her on the transfers." Analyst Park set her tablet on the table and sat down across from Naomi without being invited. She looked at the printed records, then at Naomi's legal pad, then at the laptop screen. "You mapped the account routing manually," Park said. It wasn't a criticism. It was closer to assessment. "I started with what I had," Naomi said. "The digital trail goes 3 layers deeper than what you can see from the authorization logs. Whoever structured these was careful. Shell accounts, holding companies, 2 of them registered in jurisdictions we don't have exchange agreements with." Park turned her tablet to show a diagram. "But careful people still make the same kinds of mistakes. Timing patterns, access windows. The transactions cluster in a 4-hour window every time, and the clustering is too consistent to be random. Someone with a fixed schedule did this." Naomi looked at the diagram. Then she looked at her own notes. Then she said, without particularly meaning to say it out loud, "The operations calendar." Everyone in the room looked at her. She reached for her laptop and pulled up the file she'd maintained for 3 years, the master operations calendar for the executive floor, which she'd structured and updated and which every senior director had access to for scheduling purposes. She ran her eyes down the entries. Every transfer happened on nights when the operations director was either traveling or had an early morning flight the next day, she said. "I know because I booked his travel. I booked all the executive travel. And I'm the one who set the system rule that suppresses authorization notifications during overnight hours when the executive team is in transit, because Tae-hyuk, Mr. Kang, doesn't want his security flags triggering on every routine wire when half the team is crossing time zones." The room was quiet. She looked up. Tae-hyuk was watching her with the particular stillness that meant he was ahead of where she was in the logic chain and was waiting to see if she'd get there herself. She got there. "The operations director knew about the notification suppression rule," she said, "because I sent a memo about it to all senior executives when I implemented it 14 months ago." She paused. "Park Min-seok." The name landed in the room differently than other words landed. Director Yoon's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of tell. Analyst Park kept looking at the tablet. Tae-hyuk said nothing. He's been here 12 years, Yoon said finally. His voice was careful, measured. He has full operational clearance. Which is exactly why it works, Naomi said. Nobody questions what he approves because he has the authority to approve it. And nobody questioned the transfers because they came through my credentials. And I had the authority to authorize routine financial operations. She set the pen down. He used both of us as cover. The money moved because it looked like two trusted people independently signed off on it. We don't have confirmation, Yoon said. No, Naomi agreed. But I have 7 months of calendar entries that I can cross-reference against every single transfer date, and I would bet my last dollar they line up. Yoon looked at Taehyuk. Taehyuk looked at Naomi. Cross-reference it, he said. What? It took her 40 minutes. It took 40 minutes because she was thorough, which meant she didn't just look for matches. She looked for exceptions, for any transfer date that didn't fit the pattern, because one exception could unravel the whole theory, and she needed the theory to be solid before anyone did anything with it. There were no exceptions. 11 for 11. Every transfer, every travel date, every suppressed notification window. She printed the cross-reference. She stapled it to the transfer records. She put the whole packet in front of Taehyuk without saying anything. He read it. He didn't read fast. He read the way he did everything, completely, like he was going to be tested on it. When he set it down, his face was doing something she didn't have a word for. Not anger. Anger was too simple. It was the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of a 12-year relationship with another human being and discovering it had been built on something rotten and having to decide what to do with that before his body decided for him. I need to talk to Min Seok, he said. If you talk to him now, he'll know we found it, Naomi said. And if he knows we found it, he runs, Yoon said. Or worse, Park said quietly. She'd barely spoken in the last hour, just worked her tablet and occasionally asked Naomi for specific document dates. He has access to the shipping schedules. All of them. If he burns those on his way out, he won't run yet, Taehyuk said. He doesn't know we know. As of right now, as far as he's aware, Naomi came back to work, and the situation with Han Dojin is the crisis. He'll be watching to see how that plays out. He picked up the printed cross-reference and looked at it again. We set a trap. We let him believe the next transfer is still on schedule, and we watch where the money goes. He'll need to access the authorization system, Naomi said. My credentials. You'll be monitoring. I'll need my credentials fully restored, which means it'll look like business as usual from his end. Taehyuk nodded. Naomi picked up her pen, made a note on the legal pad, underlined it twice. I want it on the record, she said, that I find it extremely uncomfortable to be used as bait twice in the same week. Nobody laughed, but the air in the room shifted very slightly in the direction of something that wasn't quite as heavy. The next 4 days had the specific texture of dread that comes not from things happening, but from things being about to happen. Naomi sat in the small conference room every day and worked and waited. She had her credentials restored. She had access to the full financial database going back 11 years. She had Analyst Park coming in twice a day with updates on the account trail, which was slowly resolving into something they could actually map. She had a security detail that she was not supposed to acknowledge in public, which meant 2 men she wasn't allowed to look at directly were spending a lot of time near her in various contexts, and she found this more irritating than reassuring. She also had Taehyuk. He came in the first morning and sat across from her and asked what she needed, which was different from his previous management approach of simply issuing directives and expecting completion. She noticed this. She didn't say anything about it. She told him she needed the original vendor contracts for the past 2 years and the complete org chart for operations, and he had both sent up within the hour. He came back at noon with food from the place 2 blocks over that she'd mentioned once, 8 months ago, as being good. She looked at the paper bag and then at him. I know you don't eat when you're deep in something, he said, which was true, and also meant he had been paying attention for longer than she'd realized. He put the bag on the table and left. She ate and kept working. On the 3rd day, she found something she hadn't been looking for. She was in the vendor contracts, following a secondary thread from one of the transfer accounts when she pulled a freight contractor file that didn't match the contract template she'd standardized 18 months ago. Small difference, a different clause in Section 4 regarding liability for route deviation. She almost moved past it. She was tired. She had been sleeping badly, waking up at 2 a.m. every night now, with her heart doing the thing it had done when the phone call came, and she was caffeinating heavily to compensate, which was making her jittery and not actually solving the sleep problem. She didn't move past it. She pulled every freight contractor file from the past 2 years, laid them out on the table, went through Section 4 of each one. 14 contracts had the non-standard clause. All 14 were associated with the same 4 shipping routes, the northern routes, the ones Taehyuk had been protecting, the ones Han Do-jin wanted. Her pen went still on the legal pad. Min Se-ok hadn't just been moving money. He'd been quietly rewriting contract terms on the routes that mattered most, inserting liability clauses that would make it nearly impossible to enforce security protocols if there was a route deviation, which would mean that when Han Do-jin was ready to move his people through those routes, the paperwork would already be structured to prevent Taehyuk's organization from responding effectively. She sat with this for a long time. Then she called Taehyuk. He answered on the second ring. "The contracts," she said. "He didn't just take the money. He rewrote the northern route contracts." A silence. Then, "How bad?" "Bad enough that if you tried to enforce a security hold on a route deviation right now, 14 contractors could argue the clause gives them the right to proceed without your authorization." She paused. "He's been building Han Do-jin a door for months, maybe longer. The money was just a distraction," Taehyuk said. His voice had gone very quiet, which she had learned meant the opposite of calm. "The money was what we were supposed to find if we ever got close, to make us think we had the whole picture." "Yes." She heard him breathe, just once, controlled. "Are you still in the conference room?" "Yes." "Don't go anywhere. I'm coming down." He arrived in 6 minutes, which meant he'd walked fast enough that the security team had to adjust their formation, something she learned later from the way one of her details shot a look at his colleague when Taehyuk came through the door. He had the contracts spread on the table before she finished standing up, and he went through them the same way she had. Section 4, every single one, not trusting her summary because he needed to see it himself. And she understood that. She didn't take it personally. When he finished, he stood with both hands flat on the table and looked at the contracts and didn't speak for a while. 12 years, he said, and it wasn't addressed to her or to anyone. It was the kind of statement people make to the air when they need the words to be somewhere outside their head. "I know," she said. "I was at his daughter's birthday party." "I know." He straightened up. His jaw was doing the tight thing. His hands came off the table and went into his pockets, which she'd noticed he did when he needed to keep them from doing something else. "We can't wait for the transfer window now," he said. "If he knows the contract issue is exposed, he doesn't. I'm the only one who found it. Yet. Min Se-ok is careful. He'll have a trigger, something that tells him if anyone pulls those files." He looked at her. "How long were you in that database?" "About 40 minutes on the contractor files specifically. Then we have maybe 48 hours before he knows someone was looking." He moved toward the door. "I need to move the trap up." "Taehyuk." She said his name without the professional prefix, which she had never done in 3 years, and it stopped him the way an alarm stops a room. They both noticed it. Neither of them addressed it. "If you move the trap up, it has to be airtight. He cannot suspect before you're ready to take him." "I know." "And Han Do-jin's people are still watching this building. If Min Se-ok tips them before you can contain him—" "I know, Naomi. I know." He turned from the door, looked at her fully, which he did sometimes when he was about to say something that cost him something to say. "I have people I trust. I'm going to use them. You focus on the financial documentation. I need everything printed and organized in a format that can go to the prosecutors when this is done. Can you do that in 48 hours? She looked at the table, the contracts, the transfer records, the cross-reference, the 3 legal pads she'd filled. "Yes," she said. He left. The door closed. Naomi sat back down. She picked up her pen. She looked at what she had in front of her, all the careful, patient, devastating evidence that a trusted man had been selling out the people around him for longer than anyone had noticed. She thought about how many times she'd scheduled meetings for Park Min Se-ok, how many times she'd booked his travel, how many times he'd come through the executive floor and stopped at her desk and asked about her weekend, complimented her filing system, called her the secret weapon of the whole operation. She thought about whether any of it had been real. She thought about whether she was naive to have thought it was. She decided she wasn't naive. She decided that being the kind of person who assumed good faith until given specific evidence otherwise was not a flaw. It was just occasionally expensive. She started organizing the documents. It was late on the fourth night when Yoon came to the conference room door. Not Taehyuk, Yoon, which was unusual enough that Naomi looked up immediately. Yoon had the expression she associated with situations where information was being delivered at a cost. "We have a problem," he said. She waited. "Your driver," he said. "Kim Chol-soo, the one assigned to your transport since you came back." "What about him?" Yoon came fully into the room and closed the door behind him. "He ran a different route home for you yesterday. Traffic reason given. But we pulled the footage from the intersection, and there was no traffic incident. He deviated the route by 4 blocks and passed within range of a location we have flagged as a known Handojin communication point." The cold started at the back of Naomi's neck and moved down. "He was checking in," she said. "We think so. He's been my driver for 6 weeks. He drove me today. He was going to drive me home tonight." "We know." Yoon looked uncomfortable, which on his face was a very small adjustment. "Mr. Kong is aware. Your transport for tonight is already changed, but there's a secondary issue." He paused. "We cross-referenced Chul-soo's access logs against the building security system. He accessed the parking garage camera controls 3 times in the past week. The footage for those windows is intact. He didn't delete it, but we believe he was mapping the access points, sending a layout." Naomi set her pen down very precisely. "He's not the leak in the financials," she said. "That's Min Seok. So Chul-soo is a different operation. Han Dojin doesn't need the financial information. He needs access, physical access, to you." Yoon's eyes were steady. "We believe there are at least 2 people inside this building working for Han Dojin independently of the Min Seok situation, possibly more." The room was the same room it had been 30 seconds ago. Same window, same table, same stacks of documents. But the way Naomi experienced it had changed in some fundamental way that she understood would not simply change back. She had come back to help uncover one infiltration. There were 2, possibly more, and one of them had been sitting in the driver's seat 6 inches behind her head every day this week. She thought about the word ordinary, the farmer's market, sleeping until 7. She thought about Mrs. Kim's voice in the hallway. She thought about the fact that she had chosen to walk back through this door 11 days after walking out of it, and that choice had led her here, to this table, with this information, in a building where the number of people she could genuinely trust had just gotten significantly smaller. "Who knows about this besides you and Mr. Kong?" she asked. "Chief Security Guard Choi. He's the one who flagged the footage anomaly." Naomi looked at Yoon. Something very small and very cold moved through her chest. "How long has Choi been with Mr. Kong?" she asked. "Over 10 years. And he's the one who found it." She said it carefully, like she was testing the weight of each word. "He found the footage anomaly, flagged it to you, and that's how you know about the driver." Yoon's eyes shifted, very slightly. She saw it. "Yes," he said. "Has anyone verified," Naomi said slowly, "that the footage Choi flagged is what actually happened? That he didn't alter it before he brought it to you?" The silence that followed had a specific quality. Not empty, but full of something being recalculated. Yoon said, "I'll need to pull the raw archive." "You need to pull it right now," Naomi said. "And you need to do it from a terminal that Choi doesn't have admin access to. And you need to do it before you say anything else to him about what we know." Yoon was already moving toward the door. "Yoon," he stopped. "Don't tell anyone else. Not yet. Not until we know." He left. The door closed again. Naomi sat alone in the conference room with her organized documents and her 3 legal pads and the growing understanding that the trap they were building had been visible to people on the other side for longer than any of them had realized, and that the man who had been positioned closest to Taehyuk for over a decade might have just handed their entire strategy to the enemy wearing the face of someone doing his job. She picked up her phone, called Taehyuk directly. He answered before the second ring. "Choi," she said. "We need to talk about Choi." Taehyuk picked up before the second ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. "Talk," he said. "Choi flagged the driver footage to Yoon tonight. He's the one who brought it forward. He's the one who identified the deviation route and the communication point." I know. Yoon called me 10 minutes ago. Then you already see the problem. A pause. Not long. The kind of pause that happens when someone is deciding how much of what they're thinking to say out loud. He could have flagged it legitimately, Taehyuk said. 10 years. He's been with me 10 years. Min Seok has been with you 12. Silence. The raw archive, Naomi said. Has Yoon pulled it yet? He's pulling it now. From a terminal Choi doesn't have admin access to? Yes. Another pause. You thought of that faster than Yoon did. I've spent 4 days reading documents about how careful people hide things. It changes how you look at everything. She was standing now, she'd gotten up without noticing, pacing the length of the small conference room in the dark, because she hadn't turned the overhead light back on after Yoon left. Just the laptop screen and the city light coming through the window. If Choi is compromised, he's been inside your security structure for a decade. He knows your protocols. He knows your response patterns. He knows who you trust and how you move when there's a threat. I know what he knows, Taehyuk said, and something in his voice was different, stripped down, no professional distance, just the sound of a man absorbing the specific kind of damage that only comes from a long betrayal. Stay in the conference room. Don't use the building security system to contact anyone. Call me directly if anything changes. Taehyuk. She stopped pacing. If Choi knows we're close to Min Seok, if he's been feeding information out, then Han Dojin already knows about the trap. I know. Which means we don't have 48 hours. We might not have tonight. I know, Naomi. His voice was very quiet. Stay in the room. He ended the call. She stood in the dark with her phone in her hand and looked at the organized stacks of documents on the table and thought about how much careful work it was possible to do and still have the floor move underneath you. Yoon came back 47 minutes later. She knew exactly how long it had been because she had been watching the clock on her laptop with the specific attention of someone who had nothing to do but wait and found waiting intolerable. He came in and closed the door and stood with his back against it for a moment before he spoke, which told her everything before he said a word. The raw archive doesn't match what Choi submitted, Yoon said. The footage he flagged, the route deviation, the communication point, it's real. Kim Chol-soo did deviate the route. That part is accurate. But, Naomi said, but Choi edited the timestamp on the raw file before he brought it to me. The deviation happened 6 days ago, not yesterday. He's been sitting on it for 6 days. Yoon's jaw was set in the way of someone who was angry and was not going to let it be visible because anger wasn't useful right now. He waited. He held the information and watched, and he only brought it forward tonight. After I spent the afternoon in the contractor files, Naomi said. Yes. She sat down. Not because she needed to sit. She needed to move, actually. Her body wanted to do something with what it was feeling. But because she needed to think, and thinking required stillness. He's been watching what I find, she said, and feeding it out. And tonight when I went into the contractor database, he decided he needed to create a distraction, something that would pull our attention to the driver and away from the contract issue. That's our working theory. Where is he now? At his post. Main security desk, executive floor. 30 feet from Taehyuk's office. Does Taehyuk know the timestamp was altered? I called him before I came to you. And? Yoon's expression did something careful. He said to stay calm and wait for his instruction. She looked at the door, then at Yoon. How many people on the security team tonight can you personally verify are not compromised? Yoon didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. 3, he said finally. Maybe 4. In a building this size. In a building this size. Naomi picked up her pen, put it back down, picked it up again. The repetitive motion was a habit, something her hands did when her brain was moving faster than was comfortable and needed an outlet that wasn't running. Min Seok, she said. Does he know we've been looking at the financial records? He shouldn't. We've kept the forensics internal. But Choi knows I came back. He knows I'm in this room. He knows Analyst Park has been coming in twice a day. She looked at Yoon. What does Choi know about what Park has been working on? Yoon's face changed. Small change. The kind that meant the calculation he'd just done had produced a number he didn't like. He would have access to Park's building entry and exit logs, Yoon said slowly, and he would know which conference room she's been assigned to. Would he know what we've been building in here? Not from his security access, but if he's been watching. He's been watching, Naomi said. That's what he does. That's what he's been doing for however long this has been running. She stood up. We need to move everything, the documents, the database access, the financial files, all of it to a location Choi doesn't have mapped. Tonight. Right now. Mr. Kong, call him. Tell him we need to move now. Tell him I said we are out of time. But Taehyuk arrived on the 43rd floor 14 minutes later. He came with two men she hadn't seen before, not the usual security detail, different faces, different way of moving, the kind of deliberate economy that meant they were used to operating in situations where a wrong step had consequences. He looked at her when he came in, a fast, assessing look that took in the laptop, the documents, her face, the set of her shoulders, and then he turned to Yoon. Status, he said. Yoon gave it. Clean, fast, no editorializing. The timestamp alteration, the 6-day gap, the theory about the contractor database access triggering Choi's move. Taehyuk listened without interrupting. When Yoon finished, Taehyuk looked at the documents on the table. We need Min Seok and Choi contained simultaneously, he said. If either one of them knows the other is being taken, they'll burn whatever they haven't already sent out. You can't take Choi from the executive floor without him knowing something's wrong, Yoon said. He's trained. He'll read it. Then we don't go to him. Taehyuk's eyes moved to Naomi. We make him come to us. She understood what he meant before he said it. The understanding sat in her chest with the specific weight of something she didn't like but couldn't argue with. You want to use me again, she said. I want to give him a reason to move. If you leave this room and appear to be transporting the documents, he'll try to intercept them before they leave the building. Yes. And your people will be positioned. Yes. She looked at him. She thought about the driver, 6 inches behind her head all week. She thought about Yoon's answer when she asked how many people he could verify. 3, maybe 4. She thought about the word maybe. What are the odds that something goes wrong? She asked. He didn't insult her by pretending the odds were better than they were. There are variables I can't fully control. That's not an answer. It's an honest answer. He held her eyes. I will be in the corridor. I will not be behind a desk somewhere waiting for reports. I will be there. She looked at the organized stacks. 3 legal pads. Hundreds of pages. Weeks of carefully structured evidence that could dismantle everything Min Seok and Choi had built, everything Han Do-jin had been counting on. Fine, she said, but I'm carrying real documents. If I'm going to do this, I'm not carrying an empty bag. I need him to scan it and see the real thing, otherwise he'll know it's a setup. Agreed. And I want a copy of everything backed up to an external server before I walk out of this room. Analyst Park can do that in 10 minutes, Park said from the corner of the room, where she had apparently been sitting quietly long enough that Naomi had genuinely forgotten she was there. Park was already on her tablet. Give me 10 minutes. It took 12. Naomi spent those 12 minutes repacking the documents into her tote bag with the careful efficiency of someone who was trying to keep her hands busy so her brain wouldn't fully process what she was about to do. Park worked silently. The 2 men Taehyuk had brought positioned themselves in the corridor in a configuration Naomi didn't look at directly because she didn't want to know exactly how many of them there were and do the math on whether it was enough. Taehyuk came to stand beside her while she was repacking. You don't have to carry the originals, he said, quietly enough that it was between them and not the room. Yes, I do. You know I do. She didn't look up from the bag. He's been watching me for days. He knows what my work bag looks like when it's full. He'll know if it's a prop. A pause. After this is done, Taehyuk said. She looked up. After this is done, you decide what you want. No pressure. No counteroffer. If you want to walk out of this building and not come back, I will make sure you're safe, and I will not ask you to reconsider. He said it the way he said things he'd decided on, completely, without qualification. But I wanted to say it before you walked out that door, because I didn't say it the right way the first time. Naomi looked at him for a moment. Ask me again when this is over, she said. Right now I can only think about one thing at a time. She picked up the bag. She walked to the door. The 43rd floor corridor was the kind of long that seemed longer at night, when the overhead lights were on their reduced setting and the offices on both sides were dark. Naomi walked at her normal pace, not slow, Not fast, the slightly purposeful walk of someone who had somewhere to be and was mildly running late, which was her default setting and therefore the one least likely to read as performance. She heard nothing behind her. That was the point. Taehyuk's people were there, but she couldn't hear them, which was either reassuring or terrifying depending on how she thought about it, and she chose not to think about it. She reached the elevator bank, hit the button, waited. The elevator took 40 seconds to arrive, which was 40 seconds of standing in a corridor with a bag full of evidence against two men who were both somewhere in this building, and at least one of whom had been watching her movements for days. She spent those 40 seconds looking at the elevator doors and breathing through her nose and not thinking about the 40 seconds. The doors opened. She stepped in. The doors were 3 inches from closing when a hand came through them. She knew before she saw the face. Something in the body language, the specific way the hand pressed the door sensor, practiced, unhurried, the movement of someone who had timed this exactly. Choi stepped into the elevator. He was in his security uniform. He looked exactly the same as he had looked every day for the past week. Compact, professional, the weathered steadiness of a man who had been doing a demanding job for a long time. Except that his hands were loose at his sides in a way that wasn't casual, it was ready, and his eyes, when they found hers, were not doing the deferential thing they usually did when he addressed her. "Ms. Carter," he said, "working late." The doors closed. She held the bag with both hands. Her voice, when she found it, was steady in the way that things sometimes go steady right before they break. "Chief Choi, I didn't know you were on tonight. I cover when needed." He glanced at the bag. "Big load to be taking out this late. Printer was down earlier, catching up." He nodded. Looked at the floor indicator. They were moving down. "You found the contractor files," he said. Not a question. The elevator was between floors. The number above the door read 41 and was moving toward 40, and the distance between this moment and any moment where someone could reach her was entirely calculable, and the calculation was not good. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Ms. Carter." He said her name the way someone says the name of a person they're done pretending with. "I've been watching that conference room database access for 4 days. When you pulled the Northern Route files this afternoon, I knew you had it." He turned to look at her fully. "I'm going to need that bag." "No," she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, more like a minor recalibration. He'd expected compliance or panic, and she had given him neither. "You're alone in an elevator," he said. "I know where I am." "And you think—" The elevator stopped. Not at a floor. Between floors, the numbers frozen at 39. Choi had his hand on the emergency stop button. He hadn't looked away from her. Naomi's heart was doing something violent and rhythmic against her ribs. She was acutely aware of the bag in her hands, the weight of it, the width of the elevator, the distance between herself and the panel of buttons on the opposite wall. She was also, in some part of her brain that had apparently decided to stay functional, thinking about the 12 minutes it had taken Park to back up the files, about the external server, about the fact that the documents in this bag were important but not irreplaceable anymore. "You don't want to do this," she said. "I've been doing this for 3 years, Choi said. "You're the only part of it I didn't expect." He stepped toward her, 1 step, controlled. "Give me the bag." She threw it at him. Not to comply, to create the half-second of instinctive reaction that happens when something comes at a person's face unexpectedly, the half-second where everybody prioritizes the incoming object over everything else. Choi's hands came up. The bag hit his forearm. Naomi hit the emergency alarm button, the door open button, and the button for floor 39 simultaneously, in that order, with the flat of her palm, and then she pressed herself into the corner of the elevator farthest from him and filled her lungs and screamed, not a frightened scream, a deliberate, full volume, as loud as she could make it scream, the kind that travels through elevator shafts and into stairwells and through the concrete bones of a building. Choi grabbed her arm. His grip was hard and she felt it all the way to the shoulder socket. He pulled her toward him and she didn't come cleanly. She grabbed the elevator railing with her free hand and locked her elbow and made herself as difficult to move as possible, which bought her approximately 4 seconds and cost her the skin on her palm where the railing edge caught it. The elevator lurched. Someone had overridden it from outside. The doors opened on floor 39 to an empty corridor, and Choi made a decision in the quarter second he had to make it. He released her arm, grabbed the bag from the floor where it had landed, and moved toward the open doors. He got through them. Taehyuk's people were already in the corridor. What happened next was fast and brutal, and not the kind of thing Naomi watched directly. She pressed herself against the back wall of the elevator and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of a physical confrontation happening 6 feet away, with the specific awareness of someone who understood that her participation in it would not help and might actively harm the outcome. There was impact. There were voices, short-clipped commands in Korean. There was the sound of a body hitting a wall. Then silence. Then Taehyuk was in the elevator doorway, breathing harder than she'd ever seen him breathe, looking at her with an expression that bypassed everything professional and went somewhere else entirely. "Are you hurt?" he said. "My hand." She looked at her palm. The railing scrape was bleeding in the way shallow wounds bleed, more than they should for their depth, already starting to sting. "It's not bad. Where's Choi?" "Contained." He stepped into the elevator, which made it significantly smaller. He looked at her hand and then looked at her face. "Naomi, Min Seok," she said. "We still have to move on Min Seok. If Choi got a message out before, Yoon took Min Seok off the floor 4 minutes ago, simultaneous with you entering the elevator." He was still looking at her face. "It worked." She exhaled. It came out shakier than she intended. "The bag," she said. "The documents. My people have it. There are originals in there that need to stay in order, the way I organized them. Naomi." He said her name the way he'd said it in the elevator doorway, stripped of everything except what it actually meant to him, which she was only now beginning to understand was considerable. "Stop. For 1 minute. Stop." She stopped. Her hand was bleeding on the elevator floor. The emergency alarm she'd triggered was still making a low repeating sound somewhere in the shaft. The corridor outside was full of his people managing a situation she had helped create by being the kind of woman who threw bags at armed men and screamed at maximum volume and grabbed railings rather than complying. She thought about how close the geometry of the last 10 minutes had come to going differently. She thought about Choi's hand on her arm and the specific quality of his grip, which had not been the grip of someone who planned to let go. "Okay," she said. Her voice had a tremor in it that she couldn't fully control. "Okay. 1 minute." Taehyuk did something she didn't expect. He didn't speak. He didn't move toward her or away from her. He just stayed in the elevator doorway and let her have the minute without filling it with anything, which was, she realized, exactly what she needed, and somehow exactly what he understood. They had Min Seok in an interior conference room on the 38th floor by 10:45. Naomi wasn't in the room for the first part of it. Taehyuk didn't ask her to be, and she didn't ask to be, because she needed 20 minutes with a first aid kit and a glass of water before she could be useful to anyone, and she was learning to be honest about that. She was there for the second part. She came in and sat across the table from Park Min Seok and looked at the man she had scheduled meetings for, booked flights for, wished happy birthday to via the office calendar reminder system for 3 years. He looked smaller than he did in meetings. That was the thing she noticed first. Not anger, not guilt in his expression, but a quality of compression, like something that had been held under pressure for too long and had finally been released into a shape that didn't fit him anymore. He looked at her. Something moved through his face. "You found it," he said. Not accusatory, almost like relief. "Yes," she said. The calendar cross-reference. "Yes." He nodded, slowly, like he was confirming something internal. "I knew it would be the calendar. You built that system too well." He almost smiled. It didn't reach anything. "I told myself it was clean enough, but I knew the calendar was the vulnerability. I just didn't think anyone would—" He stopped. "I didn't think anyone would look that hard." "Why?" She asked it simply because she actually wanted to know, not to prosecute him, not to make him say it for the record. She wanted to understand the shape of it, the reasoning or the absence of reasoning, the thing that made a person do what he had done for as long as he had done it. "Why Jinhwan? Why Handojin? You had everything here." Min Seok was quiet for a moment. "You don't know about Jinhwan," he said. The name sat oddly in the room. She watched Taehyuk, standing at the far wall with his arms at his sides, and saw his expression do something she had never seen it do before. A full, unguarded crack, like something structural giving way. "What about Jinhwan?" Taehyuk said. His voice was very controlled. Too controlled. The kind of control that takes effort. Minseok looked at him, and in his eyes was something that looked, impossibly, like pity. He's not dead, Minseok said. He was never dead. The funeral, the body, all of it was arranged. He came to me 2 years before he disappeared, told me what he was planning, and asked if I would help him when the time came. He paused. I said yes. The room did not change. The temperature did not change. The lights did not flicker. Nothing cinematic happened to mark the moment. But Naomi felt the air in the room become something different, heavier, charged with the specific weight of a truth that had been sealed for years and was now suddenly, irreversibly open. Kang Jin-hwan, Taehyuk said, and his younger brother's name in his own mouth sounded like something being handled very carefully because it might break, has been alive for 6 years. Yes. And he's been building. Yes. Minseok looked at the table. Han Dojin isn't your primary threat. He never was. Dojin is a partner, a front. The organization giving Dojin his strategy, his financing, his access to your roots, it belongs to Jinhwan. It has for 4 years. He paused. Han Dojin is the face. Your brother is the architect. Taehyuk did not move. I was standing against the wall and he did not move, and his face had settled into something she didn't have a word for. Not blankness, because blankness was empty. And this was full, unbearably full, of something she could only read as grief that had been converted in real time into something harder and colder and entirely more dangerous. The port of Busan, Minseok said. The northern route contracts I restructured. He's been building to a specific moment. A window when your organization's security infrastructure is disrupted enough that he can move his people through those routes without interference. He's been planning the timing for 8 months. Minseok looked up. The window opens in 6 days. Naomi looked at Taehyuk. Taehyuk was looking at the wall behind Minseok's head. His jaw was set. His hands were at his sides. He was doing the processing thing she recognized from hard briefings, except this was not a briefing. This was the wreckage of a grief he'd carried for 6 years being revealed as something manufactured by someone he loved. And the processing he was doing right now was the hardest kind. The kind you do not fully finish in a single room on a single night. 6 days, he said. Yes. Port of Busan. Container Yard 7. He has people positioned already. He's been staging it for weeks. Minseok's voice was flat now. Not remorseful, not defensive, just empty. The voice of someone who has been holding a secret so long that releasing it feels less like confession and more like setting down something too heavy to carry further. He knew you'd find the leaks eventually. He planned for it. The Port of Busan operation was always meant to be the end. The final move, whether or not you figured out the rest. Naomi picked up her pen. Her hand, the scraped one, had been wrapped by this point, but the pressure of the pen still registered along the wound, and she noted it distantly as information. She wrote, Port of Busan. Container Yard 7, 6 days. She underlined it once. She looked at Taehyuk. I was already looking at her, and what she saw in his face was not the mafia boss she'd worked for, not the controlled and fearsome executive presence that made entire rooms recalibrate when he walked in. It was something underneath all of that. A man who had buried his brother and mourned him and built something in the years after that mourning and was now being told the mourning itself had been a manipulation, a tool, a weapon aimed at him from the person who knew exactly where to aim. Tell me everything, he said to Minseok. Not loudly, not with force, with the quiet of someone who has run out of reason to manage their voice and has decided that quiet is the most dangerous register available to them. Every detail, every contact, every conversation you had with my brother, from the beginning. Minseok looked at him for a moment, then he started talking. Naomi wrote everything down, her pen moving steadily across the legal pad, her handwriting slightly less neat than usual because of the scraped palm, but still legible, still organized, still the work of someone whose value in a crisis was not that she was the loudest or the strongest, but that she was the one who made sure nothing was lost, nothing was missed, nothing disappeared into the chaos without being recorded and understood. Outside, Seoul moved through its night, indifferent and enormous. In a room on the 38th floor, a dead man's name was being spoken aloud for the first time in 6 years, and everything that had seemed like the full shape of the danger turned out to have been only its shadow, cast by something larger and older, and far more personal than any of them had been prepared to face. Min Seok talked for 3 hours. Naomi filled 2 legal pads. Her handwriting started neat and got progressively less so as the night wore on, and the scraped palms stiffened and her eyes developed the particular dry ache of someone who needed sleep and wasn't going to get it. She wrote without editorializing, without pausing to react, because the moment she paused to react, she would lose the thread. And the thread was everything right now. Dates, names, contact protocols. The specific language Jinwan had used in their first meeting, which Min Seok recited from memory with the accuracy of someone who had replayed it enough times that it had grooved itself permanently into whatever part of the brain store's formative moments. Taehyuk stood against the wall for the first 40 minutes. Then he sat down, which surprised her. Not at the table, in the chair near the door, slightly removed, which she understood was distance management. He needed to hear everything, and he could not do it from 3 feet away from the man saying it. He did not interrupt. He asked 2 questions in 3 hours. Both were specific, logistical, the kind of questions that are not really questions but confirmations of things you've already worked out and need someone else to say aloud so they become real. When Min Seok finished, the room was the particular quiet of a space where something large has just stopped moving. Taehyuk looked at Naomi. She held up the legal pads. He nodded once. "Get some sleep," he said to her. "Both of you." She almost laughed. She controlled it. "You have 6 days," she said. 5 now." He stood up. "I need 4 to prepare. That leaves 1 for margin." He looked at the table, at nothing, at the middle distance where plans get built. "Go sleep. I need you functional in the morning, not running on bad coffee and adrenaline." "I've been running on bad coffee and adrenaline since I came back. I'm acclimated." His expression did the thing that wasn't quite a smile. 3 hours. That's all I'm asking." She got 4. They felt like 40 minutes. The next 5 days had a different texture from the days before them. The careful, patient work of building evidence gave way to something harder and faster. The work of preparing for a confrontation that was going to happen whether they were ready or not. On a timeline set by a dead man who wasn't dead. At a location chosen for its strategic value by someone who had spent 6 years learning to think the way his brother thought. Taehyuk worked in a way she had not seen him work before. She had seen him manage crises, controlled, deliberate, allocating resources with the precision of someone who had done it long enough that the methodology was unconscious. This was different. This was a man operating with the knowledge that the opponent across the board was not a rival or an enemy in the abstract sense, but a specific person who knew the shape of his thinking, had grown up watching him make decisions, and had spent 6 years engineering a situation designed to exploit exactly that familiarity. He slept 3 hours a night. She knew because she was working late enough to see his office light on when she finally left, and early enough to see it already on when she arrived. She didn't comment on it. She was sleeping 5 hours herself and operating in the gray zone where the body keeps going but everything costs slightly more than it should. They had 12 people she could confirm were clean, Yoon, Park, the 2 men from the elevator night, and 8 others that Taehyuk had verified through a process she didn't ask about in detail because she had enough details. 12 people to plan and execute a containment operation at the port of Busan against an organization that had been building for 4 years and had home route advantage in the container yard. On the 3rd day, she found the layout. Container Yard 7 at the port of Busan was not, as its designation suggested, a single area. It was a complex of interlocking zones, primary staging areas, secondary transfer corridors, a crane access road that ran along the waterfront, and a series of stacked container rows that created natural choke points and blind spots depending on which direction you came from. Min Seok had given them a general position. He hadn't given them a floor plan because he didn't have one. His contact with Jinhwan's operation had been financial and logistical, not tactical. Naomi pulled the public port authority records. Then the freight contractor files she'd already spent a week inside. Then cross-referenced the northern route contract terms with the specific container assignments attached to those routes. Because if Jinhwan had been rewriting contracts to control route access, he'd also needed to control physical space at the destination point, which meant somewhere in the contractor assignment logs, there would be a cluster of container positions that didn't move, didn't turn over, stayed assigned to the same shell entities regardless of cargo status. She found the cluster on the 4th day. 14 containers, all assigned to a freight entity called Seohan Pacific Transit, none of them showing active cargo movement in 11 months, despite being assigned premium yard positions that should have been cycling every 3 to 4 weeks. 14 stationary containers in a specific configuration in the northeast quadrant of Yard 7. She brought it to Taehyuk at 11 at night. He looked at the printout for a long time. "He's been staging equipment in them," he said. "That's what I think. Weapons, vehicles, personnel materials. 11 months of quiet accumulation." She sat across from him. "The configuration, the way they're arranged, it creates a natural defensive perimeter. Anyone coming into the yard from the main entrance would be walking into a 3-sided enclosure before they could see what was inside it." He looked at her. "He's not just moving through that yard," she said. "He's set it up as a base of operations. The port of Busan isn't a transit point. It's where he's planning to be when this happens." The silence. "He wants to meet me there," Taehyuk said. "Not a question. A recognition. He chose the port because he knows how I respond to threats at a shipping infrastructure point. He knows I come personally. He knows I don't send people ahead and wait for reports when it's the northern routes." He set the printout down. "He built a location that would make me walk in the front." "Then we don't walk in the front," she said. "No." He looked at the cluster diagram she'd marked on the printout. "We come from the water side." They left for Busan on the 6th day at 2 in the morning, which put them at the port in the gray pre-dawn window when visibility was low, and the yard's overnight crew had settled into the particular fatigue of the last shift hour. 3 vehicles, 12 people. Naomi in the second vehicle with Yoon in Park, which was not where she'd planned to be. She'd planned to stay in Seoul managing communications, until Taehyuk had come to her that morning and said, without preamble, that the communication coordination needed to happen on site because the port's signal infrastructure had too many interference variables, and he needed someone managing the document and intelligence relay in real time, not remotely. She had known it was partly that and partly something else. She hadn't said so. The drive to Busan was 3 hours and 40 minutes of the kind of darkness that sits outside car windows on overnight highway drives. The flat black of fields, and the occasional constellation of lights from a rest stop or overpass, the yellow lane markers strobing in the headlights. Nobody talked much. Yoon ran through the tactical sequence once at the beginning and then didn't repeat it, because the people in the vehicles either knew it or they didn't, and repetition at this point was just a way of managing nerves that served no one. Naomi sat with her bag on her lap and her legal pad on top of the bag and didn't write anything. She looked out the window. She thought about the farmer's market. She did this deliberately, not as an escape but as a calibration. She needed to remember what ordinary felt like, so she could remember what she was trying to get back to. What all of this was in service of, because the alternative was to let the current situation become its own self-contained logic, and she'd seen enough of this world in the past weeks to know that was how people got permanently absorbed by it. She thought about Mrs. Kim's courtyard, whether the fountain had been fixed yet. She thought about Kong Jin-hwan, who had been dead for 6 years and wasn't. The port at 4:30 in the morning was enormous and industrial and smelled of salt water and diesel and the particular damp cold of coastal air that gets into your clothes and stays there. Container stacks rose 30 feet on either side of the access roads, painted in the colors of global shipping companies, their surfaces streaked with rust and rain. The crane arms were silhouettes against a sky that was starting to lighten at its edges. Not dawn yet, but the suggestion of it, the sky beginning to make its argument. They came in from the water side, as planned, a freight pier 200 meters south of Yard 7, accessed through a contact of Yoon's who had the relevant clearances and the relevant motivation to not ask questions. 12 people moving through a working port in the last dark hour, staying inside the shadow corridors between container rows, communicating in short bursts through earpieces that Naomi had been fitted with for the first time and found disorienting in the way new sensory inputs are always disorienting. She was positioned at a communications point near the Yard 7 perimeter, a narrow gap between 2 container stacks that gave her a sightline to the northeast quadrant where Jin-hwan's cluster was, and a position from which she could relay intelligence to Taehyuk's earpiece as his team moved in. She had a radio. She had the Port Authority layout she'd printed and marked. She had Yoon 2 containers to her left and one of Taehyuk's verified men directly behind her. She noted with the distant clarity of extreme alertness, absolutely terrified. She had been managing it since the drive, keeping it in a contained space in her chest where it could exist without interfering with function. She was not good at this. She was getting better at it through unasked-for practice. At 4:47, Taehyuk's team entered Yard 7. At 4:49, everything went wrong. The containers opened from the inside, not one, all 14, simultaneously, the corrugated metal doors swinging outward in a coordinated sequence that told her the timing had been mechanical, preset, triggered by a signal she hadn't seen sent. And from inside the containers came people, not the skeleton crew she'd estimated from the physical staging capacity, but more, significantly more, organized into positions with the speed of people who had rehearsed this exact moment, fanning out through the northeast quadrant in vectors that immediately controlled the 3 main approach corridors. She keyed her radio. They were waiting. 14 containers, all open. I'm counting. She pressed herself against the container wall and tried to count the moving shapes in the yard's work lighting. At least 30, possibly more. They knew the approach. Taehyuk's voice in her ear. Stay at your position. They have the corridors. I know. Stay. The sound that followed was the sound she had been, on some level, dreading since the night in the elevator. Not the controlled sounds of a planned operation, but the chaotic percussion of a situation that had broken from its script. Shouting in Korean. The crack of something impacting something else. Movement in her peripheral vision to the right that was too fast and too purposeful to be port workers. She pressed further into the gap between the containers. Rain came. It hadn't been forecast and it came anyway, the way weather does when nobody needs it, starting as the kind of fine mist that you don't notice until you're wet and escalating within 4 minutes to a real rain, heavy enough to affect visibility, heavy enough to turn the container yard's concrete surfaces to something that reflected the work lights in shifting orange patterns and made every footstep audible. In the rain and the noise, she heard a voice she didn't recognize say something, and then heard a voice she did recognize answer it. Taehyuk. And then another voice, similar in register to Taehyuk's, but with a difference she couldn't name, something in the cadence, the particular musicality of it, the way it shaped Korean differently at the edges of words. A voice that had the same bones as the voice she'd been listening to for weeks, and was also definitively not that voice. She moved. She knew she wasn't supposed to. She moved anyway, out of the gap, staying low against the container wall, moving toward the sound because the sound was wrong, and the wrongness of it was pulling her toward it the way wrongness always pulled her. The same instinct that had made her cross-reference the transfers, that had made her look at Section 4 of 14 contracts, that made her unable to let an anomaly sit unexamined. She came around the corner of a container stack. In the center of the yard's northeast quadrant, in the heavy rain and the orange-reflected light, Kang Taehyuk stood facing a man she had never seen except in a framed photograph on Taehyuk's desk that she had dusted around for 3 years without ever asking about. Kang Jinwon was 34 years old and looked like a version of his brother drawn by someone who had the right references but had made different choices with them. Same structure, same height, but where Taehyuk's stillness read as controlled, Jinwon's read as amused. I was standing in the rain without apparent concern for the rain. He had his hands in the pockets of a dark jacket, and he was looking at his older brother with the specific expression of someone watching a performance they wrote themselves. 10 feet between them. The container yard moving and shouting and crashing around them as Taehyuk's 12 people tried to hold against 30 and were doing it. She could see that. They were doing it, but they were stretched, and it was costing them. Jinwon said something in Korean that she didn't catch. Taehyuk said nothing. Then Jinwon looked past his brother and found her. He looked at her the way she would look at a document that confirmed a hypothesis, satisfied, unsurprised, something vindicated in his expression. "The secretary," he said, in English, for her benefit. "I wondered if he'd bring you." He looked back at Taehyuk. "That's how I knew it would end here, by the way. He never brings civilians to operational sites. 12 years I've been waiting for him to break one of his own rules, and you made him do it in, what was it, 6 weeks? "She's not here as a civilian," Taehyuk said. His voice was completely level in the rain. "She's here because she built the intelligence that got us to this yard." "I know. I read her work." Jinwon tilted his head slightly. "The calendar cross-reference, the contractor files, the container cluster analysis." He paused. "She's very good. You should have told her what she was working in from the beginning. She would have found this faster." "You monitored our investigation," Taehyuk said. Choi gave me updates until you took him. Jinhwan said it without heat, without regret, the way someone describes a tool that wore out. After that, I worked from what I knew about how you respond to things. You're predictable, Hyung. You've always been predictable. You find a threat, you control the information, you build a response, you move. You moved exactly on schedule. And Min Seok? Useful. Less so once he decided to tell you everything. Something crossed Jinhwan's face. Not anger, closer to disappointment, the theoretical kind, from someone who hadn't expected loyalty but had hoped for more durable self-interest. He got sentimental. They always get sentimental eventually. He got tired, Taehyuk said, of carrying something that heavy. The same could be said of me. Jinhwan looked at him. The rain was running down both their faces. 6 years, Hyung, 6 years of building this from nothing, without your name, without your infrastructure, without anyone in this city knowing I was alive. Do you have any idea what that requires? You could have come back. To what? To being the second Kong? To running the parts of the organization you didn't want to run yourself and being thanked for it at family dinners? His voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which was worse. I had a different idea of what I was capable of. You just never asked. The yard behind Jinhwan erupted. One of Taehyuk's men went down. Not seriously. She could see him moving, trying to get up. And 3 of Jinhwan's people moved to reinforce a position near the crane access road. The tactical situation was deteriorating in the slow, undeniable way of a numbers problem that couldn't be solved by quality alone. And then she heard the sound from behind her. Footsteps. Fast. She turned. A man was coming at Taehyuk from his left, from the gap between 2 containers, moving in the specific low and fast way of someone trained to close distance before the target's processing catches up. He had something in his hand that caught the work light, and she identified it before she could think about identifying it. A blade, fixed, short, the kind used for close work. Taehyuk hadn't seen him. He was looking at his brother. Naomi looked at the ground. Beside the container stack, where the base met the concrete, there was a rusted steel rod, loose, about 2 feet long, the kind of debris that accumulates in working industrial yards and gets kicked to the edges. She grabbed it. The rust bit into the scrape on her palm from the elevator railing, and she felt it all the way up her forearm, and she held the rod anyway, both hands, and she stepped forward, and she hit the attacker's arm as he raised it. She hit it hard, harder than she'd known she was capable of hitting something. The rod connected above the elbow with a sound that she felt in her teeth, and the man's arm bent in a direction it shouldn't bend, and the blade dropped and he went down sideways, taking most of his weight on his shoulder, making a sound that she chose immediately not to think about. Her hands were shaking. The rod was still in them. Taehyuk turned. He looked at the man on the ground. He looked at her. He looked at the rod. She looked at the rod too. "I need to put this down," she said, and her voice was a stranger's voice, too calm for what her body was doing. "Not yet," he said. He turned back to his brother. Jinhwan was watching her. His expression had changed. The settled amusement was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, recalibrated, the way a calculation changes when a variable turns out to be different from what was entered. "Interesting," he said. "She's the reason you lose," Taehyuk said. "Not because she's a weapon, because she's the reason I see things I wouldn't have seen. The transfers, the contracts, the container cluster, all of it. She found it because she pays attention to things I didn't think to pay attention to, and she pays attention to them because she actually cares what happens to the people involved. You spent 6 years studying how I operate. You forgot to account for the one variable that was never part of my operating pattern before." Jinhwan looked at him. "Someone I trusted completely," Taehyuk said. Something moved through Jinhwan's face. Quick, gone. But she saw it. She saw everything. Her alertness was at a frequency she had never operated at before and hoped to never operate at again. And what she saw in that half-second was not anger and not contempt. It was something that lived in the same neighborhood as grief. "You never trusted me completely," Jinhwan said. "I know," Taehyuk said. "That was my failure, not yours." The yard was quieting, not because the confrontation was over, but because the math had finally shifted. She could hear it in the quality of the sounds, the reduction of movement, the way contested situations settle when one side runs out of sustainable positions. Yoon's voice in her earpiece, low and steady. "We have the perimeter. His people are pulling back or contained." Jinhwan heard it too. He didn't need an earpiece. He could read a battle the same way his brother could. He looked at the yard, then at Taehyuk, then at Naomi, then back at Taehyuk. "You're going to arrest me," he said. Not a question, a read. "Yes. You could kill me. You have the standing. In this world, you have every standing." "I know." "Then why—" "Because she's still holding a steel rod," Taehyuk said, and the thing in his voice that wasn't quite humor and wasn't quite tenderness occupied the space between them for a moment in the rain, and it would be a very poor way to thank her for using it. Jinhwan looked at Naomi again. The recalibration in his expression had settled into something she couldn't fully name, closest to respect, but with something underneath it that was more complicated than respect. Something that looked like the recognition of a variable he had genuinely failed to model. He put his hands in front of him, wrists together. Taehyuk looked at Yoon, who had materialized from somewhere with flex cuffs, the way Yoon tended to materialize with whatever was needed at the precise moment it was needed, which she had come to find deeply comforting. As Yoon moved toward Jinhwan, Taehyuk turned to Naomi. She was still holding the rod. Her hands had stopped shaking, which was either because the crisis moment had passed or because she had exceeded the body's capacity for sustained trembling and had moved into some quieter territory on the other side of it. Her palm was bleeding again through the bandage. Her shoes were soaked. Her hair, which she had secured very carefully that morning, knowing she would be outside, had lost the battle with 4:30 a.m. port rain approximately 30 minutes ago. Taehyuk reached out and put his hand over hers on the rod, gently. The way you take something from someone who is still holding it because they forgot they were holding it. She let it go. She looked at her hands, looked at the yard, looked at Kang Jinhwan standing in the rain with his wrists in front of him, being processed by Yoon with the flat efficiency of a man who had done this before. "Is it over?" she said. Taehyuk looked at the yard, at his brother, at the contained perimeter, at the 14 open containers standing empty in the northeast quadrant, all the stored threat emptied out of them. "This part," he said. She nodded. She wrapped her arms around herself because she was cold, deeply, bone-level cold, the kind that comes from sustained adrenaline and wet clothes in 4:30 a.m. in a coastal container yard. And she stood in the port of Busan rain and waited for the part that came next. They brought Jinhwan out of the port at 5:42 in the morning, through the freight pier they'd come in on, in the gray beginning of a dawn that didn't offer much comfort, just light, flat, and cold, the kind that shows you everything without making any of it look better. Naomi watched from the pier as Yoon and two of the verified men walked him down the gangway toward the vehicles. Jinhwan moved cooperatively, which was somehow worse than if he'd struggled. He had the bearing of a man who had already moved past this scene in his head and was thinking about the next one, except there wasn't going to be a next one. And she wondered if that had registered yet or if it would take longer. If the full weight of what was over would come for him later, in a room somewhere, in the dark, the way grief and reckoning usually came. She was sitting on a metal equipment case with a thermal blanket around her shoulders that someone had produced from somewhere and put on her without asking, which she had accepted without comment because she was cold enough that pride was not a functional consideration. Her palm had been rewrapped by one of Taehyuk's people, cleanly, competently, the bandage tight enough to be effective and loose enough not to interfere with the hand's use. She had drunk half a bottle of water. She was holding the other half. 3 of Taehyuk's 12 people had been injured in the yard, none critically. She had gotten a report from Yoon in the controlled, bloodless language he used for casualty updates, which told her that 2 had taken significant hits and were being transported to a private medical contact in Busan, and 1 had a fractured wrist from a confrontation near the crane access road that they would be managing outpatient. All 3 were conscious and stable. She had written this down on the last page of her second legal pad with the slightly dissociated efficiency she'd been running on for hours, noted it, and then sat with the weight of it. 3 people who had gone into that yard on a plan she'd helped build, and 3 people who were hurting because of it. She knew, rationally, that the plan had been necessary. She knew the casualties could have been significantly worse given the ratio of opposition. She knew all of that as information. It sat separately from the feeling. Taehyuk came and sat beside her on the equipment case. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled down his face and been wiped at, leaving a smear that he hadn't fully addressed because he'd had other priorities. His jacket was destroyed, Rain, yard grime, the general violence of the last 2 hours. He sat close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, which was the closest they had physically been since the elevator, and she didn't move away from it. They watched Jinhuan be loaded into the rear vehicle. "How long will you hold him?" she asked. "Until I can structure the transfer to legal channels that won't collapse under Jinhuan's own network pressure. He has people in places I haven't fully mapped yet. Moving too fast means losing him before the case is built." He was watching the vehicle. 3 months. Maybe 4. And Han Dojin? Dojin loses his financing and his route access the moment. This morning's operation is documented and the contract modifications are reversed. Without Jinhuan's infrastructure, he's a mid-level operator with ambitions he can't fund. He paused. He'll retreat. It might take 6 months, it might take a year, but he's finished as a threat to the northern routes. Min Seok. He cooperated fully. That's on record. He looked at his hands, which had dried blood on the knuckles from somewhere in the yard that she hadn't seen happen. That doesn't mean he walks away. It means it's considered. She nodded. The vehicle with Jinhuan pulled out. She watched its taillights until they disappeared past the first row of shipping containers. "He wasn't wrong," she said, "about you never asking what he was capable of." Taehyuk was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "He wasn't. That's not the same as what he did being your fault." "I know. I'm just saying, the thing he said. The second Kong. That part was real. The rest of it was his choices. But that part was real." He looked at her. The gray morning light was not flattering to anyone. It showed the exhaustion in his face, the cut, the bruise developing along his jaw that she hadn't noticed until now. He looked like a man who had been in a container yard at 4 in the morning and come out the other side, which was exactly what he was. "When did you get so direct?" he said. "I've always been direct. You weren't paying that kind of attention before." Something moved through his face, not the almost smile. Something that went further than that, took up more space. "No," he said. "I wasn't." She pulled the thermal blanket tighter. She looked at the water beyond the pier where the morning light was starting to do something almost beautiful on the surface, the flat gray breaking up into something with dimension. "I want to go home," she said. "I want to go home and sleep for 12 hours and then eat something that isn't from a vending machine or a paper bag from a place that makes very good food but is always a little cold by the time it arrives." The driver. "I know, different driver, verified by Yoon personally. I've done this enough times now that I know the protocol." She stood up, the thermal blanket dropping from her shoulders, and she bent to pick it up because it wasn't hers to leave on a pier in Busan. "Take me home, Taehyuk." He stood up. "Yes," he said. "Oab." She slept 14 hours. She woke up in her own apartment with the specific disorientation of someone who has been sleeping so deeply that consciousness returns in stages rather than all at once. First sound, then light, then the gradual reassembly of where she was and what had happened and what day it was. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and let the reassembly happen without rushing it. Outside her window, she could hear the building. Footsteps in the corridor. Mrs. Kim's television through the wall. The woman kept it 1 volume higher than necessary, had since Naomi moved in, and this had been a minor irritant for years and was now, this morning, something that made Naomi's chest do something complicated and warm. She heard the elevator. She heard the distant sound of kids in the courtyard, which meant it was afternoon, which meant school was done, which gave her a time of day. She got up, she made coffee. She stood at her kitchen window and drank it while the apartment building moved around her in its ordinary, continuous, completely mundane way. Her phone had 47 messages. She read Taehyuk's first because it was the most recent. "Sleep. Don't open anything else until you're ready. It will all still be there." She read her mother's second, which was a voice message that she didn't play, but that she would call back within the hour, because her mother's voice messages existed on their own urgency scale that was entirely separate from everything else in her life. She read Yoon's third, a brief operational update, the 2 injured team members transferred and stable, the container yard secured and its contents cataloged, the paperwork chain for Jinhuan's transfer begun. She put the phone face down on the counter and finished her coffee. Then she called her mother. Her mother's name was Diane, and she had raised Naomi alone in Atlanta from age 9 after Naomi's father's departure, which had been handled with the specific brisk practicality that Diane applied to most of life's harder moments. She was 63 years old, worked 3 days a week at a garden center because she liked plants better than most people, and the discount was significant, and she had a voice that operated at roughly the same temperature as good coffee. Warm without being sweet, with a slight bite at the end that kept you honest. She picked up on the second ring. "You haven't called in 10 days, Diane said. "I know." "You're not in trouble." It was not a question. Diane had a quality of attention that Naomi had always assumed was a mother thing until she got old enough to work with other people and realize it was actually just a Diane thing. The ability to read the quality of a pause, the texture of 3 words, and extract information from them that most people would need a full conversation to access. "I was," Naomi said. "I'm not now." A pause on her mother's end. "Not concerned. Processing." "The job," Diane said. "Yes. The one you quit." "I went back temporarily." She set her empty mug in the sink. "It's complicated. Everything you do is complicated. You've been complicated since you were 7 and decided to reorganize my filing system because you found a better alphabetization method. You did keep using my system. That's beside the point." Another pause, different quality. "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Are you telling me the truth?" "Yes, Mama." The pause this time was the acceptance pause. "Okay," Diane said. "Then tell me the uncomplicated version when you're ready. Are you eating?" "I'm about to." "Good. Call me Sunday." The real call, not a 3-minute check-in. "Sunday," Naomi agreed. She hung up. She made eggs. She ate them standing at the kitchen counter because she hadn't quite decided to be a person who sat at tables yet, and that was fine, that was allowed. There were gradations of readiness, and she was at the standing at the counter stage, and that was enough for today. She went back to work 10 days later. Not because Taehyuk asked. He didn't ask. He had said, "After this is done." You decide what you want, and she believed him. It was one of the few things she believed without qualification. She went back because she had the unfinished work of thinking to do, and she thought better with access to the full picture, and the full picture was in the databases she'd been working in for weeks, and she wasn't done with it yet. Also, she had a proposal. She came in on a Tuesday morning, which was the day after Monday and before Wednesday, and had no particular significance except that she had always liked Tuesdays. They were the day of the week with the least drama attached to them, the day where you could actually get something done because everyone was past the Monday dread and not yet at the Wednesday hump. And Naomi had always been, at her core, a person who wanted to get things done. She went to the small conference room on the 43rd floor because it was hers now, in some unofficial way. Her legal pads were still there. She'd confirmed this via a brief message to Yoon, and the room had been kept cleared since the night they'd packed up and moved to Busan. She set up her laptop. She unpacked a new legal pad from her bag. She connected to the financial database and pulled up a file she'd been building on her personal laptop at home over the past week. In the evenings, in the hours between dinner and sleep, when her brain was still moving fast, but her body was done. At 10:30, Taehyuk knocked. He had never knocked on a door in this building in the time she'd known him. She stared at the door for a moment before she said, "Come in." He looked better than he had on the pier. The cut above his eyebrow had closed to a thin line. The bruise along his jaw had gone through yellow and was fading. He was in the charcoal suit he wore when he had external meetings, which meant his morning had already been substantive, and he was carrying 2 coffees in paper cups from the cart outside, which told her something she decided to save for later. He put one of the coffees on the table in front of her without asking if she wanted it, which was less presumptuous than it might have been from someone else given that she was currently on her 3rd cup of the morning, and the cup from the same cart was cold. "You came back," he said. "I have a proposal," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She noted that he sat across from her in the visitor's chair, not at the head of the table or at the angle that communicated authority, but directly across, which was either a choice or a habit in formation. She decided it was probably both. She pulled the file from her laptop and turned the screen toward him. "The security failures in this organization were not all human failures," she said. Choi and Min Seok were human failures, people who made choices. But the systems that allowed those choices to go undetected for years, the gaps in the authorization structure, the access overlaps, the notification suppression rules I built without anyone checking them for exploitation potential. Those are structural failures, and structural failures don't get fixed by replacing people. They get fixed by rebuilding the architecture. He looked at the screen. He was reading, not skimming. What you're looking at, she continued, is a proposed intelligence and security restructure for the entire organization. It covers financial authorization protocols, access compartmentalization, verification requirements for high-level operations, and a redundancy system for exactly the kind of late-night authorization window that Min Seok exploited. She paused. I built it over the past week. I want to implement it. He looked up from the screen. As what? He said. As whatever you call the person who designs and oversees this function. I'm not interested in going back to being an executive secretary. She said this without apology, without softening. It was simply true. I was very good at that job and I outgrew it, and I think we both knew I'd outgrew it for a while. What I want is the authority to actually build what I'm proposing. That means access, budget, and the standing to implement changes without having to go through 6 approval layers. He looked at her. Chief Strategy Officer, he said, if that's what you're calling it. It's what I'm calling it. He looked at the screen again. The file was 43 pages. She had spent 7 evenings on it. It was detailed in the way all of her work was detailed, which was to say, it was thorough to the point that most people would find it excessive and the right person would find it exactly right. This is what you did on your vacation. I don't take vacations. I take reformatting periods. He looked at her with the expression she had finally found a word for. It had taken her the better part of 3 months, but she had it now. It was the expression of a man who was surprised by something in a way that he found, despite himself, genuinely good. He got it rarely, and it was always directed at the same person. When do you want to start? He said. I already started, she said. I've been here since 8. The restructure took 4 months. Naomi built it from the conference room on the 43rd floor, which she eventually had assigned to her officially with a nameplate she requested be small and plain because large nameplates had always struck her as compensating for something. She worked with analyst Park, who turned out to have a mind that operated in pleasingly complementary ways to her own. Where Naomi thought in structures and timelines, Park thought in patterns and anomalies, and the combination produced something more complete than either of them would have built alone. She hired 2 people of her own. Both were under 30. Both were excessively thorough in ways that most hiring processes would have flagged as potential interpersonal problems. And both had the specific quality she had come to understand was the thing she was actually looking for. Not just intelligence, not just precision, but the willingness to follow an anomaly wherever it went, even when stopping would be more comfortable. She implemented the financial authorization protocols in the first month, the access compartmentalization in the second. The verification requirements took until the 3rd month because they required buy-in from operational directors who had been operating with a level of autonomy that her new system would constrain, and buy-in required conversations. And conversations with people who felt their authority was being restructured required more patience than most of the rest of it combined. Taehyuk sat in on 2 of those conversations. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The conversations went better after he was in them, not because he intimidated anyone into compliance, although that was not entirely absent as a factor, but because his presence communicated, without being said, that this restructure had his full backing and any objection to it was an objection he was aware of and had already considered and set aside. The Northern Route contracts were rewritten, all 14. Naomi did the first draft of the new standard clause herself and sent it to legal with a 3-page annotation explaining exactly why each modification from Min Seok's version was necessary and what exposure it closed. The legal team sent back 2 questions, both of which were good questions, and she answered them and the contracts were executed. Han Do-jin withdrew from the Northern Routes in the 2nd month. It happened without announcement, just a gradual absence. The intelligence reports that had been tracking his operations activity, showing decreasing movement, decreasing communication, the slow contraction of an organization that had lost its financing and its strategic architecture and was adjusting to being smaller than it had believed itself to be. By the 4th month, his name appeared in the intelligence reports with the same frequency as minor operators, which was to say, occasionally and without urgency. Jinhwan's transfer to legal channels happened in the 3rd month. It was a complex operation that Taehyuk managed without involving her, which was his choice and his right, and she didn't ask for the details. She knew the broad shape of it. The case was solid, the cooperation from Min Seok was documented, The financial trail she'd built over those first weeks of working in the 43rd floor conference room would hold under any competent examination. She knew that Taehyuk had gone to see Jinhwan once before the transfer, in whatever facility they'd been holding him, and that he'd come back from that meeting quieter than usual for 2 days, and then returned to himself, or to the version of himself that existed on the other side of all of this, which was the same person with something added and something changed in ways she didn't try to name. She thought about what Jinhwan had said on the pier, the second Kong. She thought about it not because it gave her answers, but because it sat with her. The way complicated true things sit with you after the crisis is over, and you have the space to actually look at them. She thought about what it cost a person to be secondary in their own family. She thought about Taehyuk, who had built an empire partly on the grief of a brother who had decided that disappearing was better than continuing to be peripheral, and how much of that grief had been genuine and how much of it had been used against him, and how those two things were not mutually exclusive. She thought about this on a Thursday afternoon in her office, and then she put it down and went back to the redundancy system documentation because it wasn't going to write itself. The apartment building had its fountain fixed in the 5th week. Naomi found out from Mrs. Kim, who knocked on her door one Saturday morning with a container of homemade japchae and an expression of someone who had a great deal to say and was organizing it. "The courtyard," Mrs. Kim said, once Naomi had accepted the japchae and stepped back to let her in. "The fountain, it's working." "I heard," Naomi said. "I'm glad." "Also the rent." Mrs. Kim set her small bag on Naomi's kitchen table with the comfortable authority of a person who had been someone's neighbor long enough that the kitchen table was a mutual space. Back to what it was. And a letter. A formal letter from the building management, very official, saying they are sorry for the disruption and there will be no further changes to terms for as long as any current tenant wishes to remain. "Good," Naomi said. "This was you," Mrs. Kim said. Not accusatory, declarative. "It was complicated," Naomi said. Mrs. Kim looked at her. She was 71 and had the eyes of someone who had accumulated enough life to know the difference between complicated and unwilling to explain, and she had the grace, which not everyone had, to accept the second without requiring the first. "My husband proposed here," she said. "In that courtyard. By the fountain." She looked at the window, in the direction of the courtyard, where the sound of water was faintly audible on a quiet morning. "It's a small thing. To other people, it's a small thing." "It's not small," Naomi said. Mrs. Kim patted her hand, the bandaged one, gently, like she knew. Maybe she did. Neighbors know more than people give them credit for. "Come downstairs when the fountain is running," she said. "I'll show you where he stood." In the 6th month, Taehyuk asked her to come to the rooftop. He didn't frame it as a request. He appeared in her office doorway at 7 in the evening, when most of the floor had cleared and she was still working because she was always still working, and he said, "Come upstairs when you're ready," and then left, which gave her the choice without making it a directive, which was how he'd been doing things differently, slowly, in ways she tracked without keeping a running record. She saved her work. She put her jacket on. She went upstairs. The rooftop of the KT Logistics building had never been on the list of spaces she'd maintained access to as a secretary. It was technically a utility space, accessible through a door on the 45th floor that required an additional credential she hadn't had. She had the credential now because she had credentials for everything now, which was the point of the restructure and also occasionally overwhelming when she thought about the full scope of what she'd taken on. The rooftop was plain in the way utility spaces are plain. Equipment housing, safety railings, the mechanical infrastructure of a building that didn't know it was picturesque. But Seoul from up here, in the evening, was something else. The city extended in every direction without apparent end, its lights coming on in stages as the sky went from the layered orange of early evening through the brief purple-gray of transition and into the deep blue that preceded full dark. The Han River was a dark curve to the south, reflecting nothing yet but beginning to hold the light at its edges. Taehyuk was standing at the north railing. He had his jacket on, hands in his pockets, looking at the city the way she'd seen him look at difficult documents, completely, giving it his full attention, as though somewhere in the expanse of light and structure, an answer to something was located if he looked long enough. She came to stand beside him. Not too close. The appropriate distance for two people who were still figuring out what the appropriate distance was. They stood in silence for a while. This was something she had come to understand about him. He didn't feel silence to manage it. He let it be what it was, and this had taken her some time to stop reading as coldness and start reading as its actual quality, which was a kind of respect. He didn't need to fill her silences, and he didn't expect her to fill his. "The restructure is almost done," she said. "I know. Park gave me the timeline this morning. 2 more weeks, maybe 3. The redundancy system is the last piece, and it's mostly documentation at this point. And then?" She looked at the city. "And then we see if it holds." "It'll hold," he said. "You built it." "Things I build have flaws," she said. "The notification suppression rule. I built that. It held for 3 years, and then someone exploited it. You found the exploitation. After $31 million moved through my credentials. Before anything worse happened." He looked at her. "You don't get credit taken away because the timeline wasn't perfect." She exhaled. She put her hands on the railing, which was cold under her palms. Both palms, the healed one and the unhurt one, both cold now as the evening temperature dropped. The scrape had healed cleanly, leaving a faint mark along the heel of her hand that she could feel but not see in anything less than direct light. "I've been thinking about what you said at the port," she said, "about buying the building being reckless. I said it was the fastest way to secure the entrances. Before that, you said you were moving faster than you were thinking, that you were afraid." She looked at him. "Why did you tell me that? You could have given me the logistics version, and I would have accepted it." He was quiet for a moment. Not the deflecting kind of quiet, the kind that was deciding something. "Because you'd already caught me in one lie by omission," he said. "And I wasn't—" He stopped. Tried again. "I spent 3 years managing the situation between us very carefully. What you knew, what you didn't know, what access you had, and why. I told myself it was protection, and it was, partly." He looked at the city, but it was also easier. Letting you believe you worked for a logistics company was easier than whatever the alternative was. The alternative being the truth. The alternative being the conversation we'd have to have after the truth. He turned to look at her fully, the way he did when he'd made a decision about something and was executing it without further deliberation. "You would have left. If I'd told you what you were actually working inside from the beginning, you would have left. And I wasn't—" A pause. "I wasn't prepared for that." She looked at him. She thought about 3 years of cold efficiency. Coffee she hadn't asked for from a cart 2 blocks away. Travel itinerary she'd mentioned once as good, remembered and ordered from 8 months later. An entire building purchased in 18 hours of panic dressed up as logistics. She thought about afraid and what it cost him to say it. "You could have told me," she said. Not accusatory, just the fact of it. "After the first year, after you knew you could trust me with the operational calendar and the financial authorizations and the contacts you had me managing, you knew what kind of person I was by then. You could have told me." "Yes," he said. "You didn't." "No. And now I know everything anyway, and I'm still here, and you spent 3 years protecting something you could have just—" She stopped, shook her head. "You could have just asked." "I know," he said. "That seems to be a pattern." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the city because looking at him directly when she was having a feeling of a certain magnitude was still something she was managing. "I'm not a logistics problem," she said. "I know that's how you approach things. You identify the variable, you secure it, you control the access points. That's not how this works." "I understand that now." "Do you?" "Better than I did." He turned back to the railing, both of them looking at the city again. "I'm learning that managing something and trusting it aren't the same thing. I've managed very well for a very long time, and I confused them." She was quiet. "I don't want to manage you," he said, and the simplicity of it was the thing that got her. No construction around it, no qualifications, just the sentence by itself. "I don't want to manage what you know or what you do or where you go or how close you are to the parts of my life that are dangerous. I want you in those parts with your eyes open." He paused. "I should have wanted that from the beginning. I didn't understand what I was doing by not wanting it until the morning. You came into my office and put your resignation letter on my desk, and I realized the thing I was most afraid of wasn't the operational disruption. The city was fully in its night mode now, the sky overhead completely dark, the lights below complete and continuous. Somewhere south, the Han River caught the city's glow and gave it back. "What were you most afraid of?" she said. "That I'd already missed the only real chance I'd have at being known by someone who wasn't afraid of me," he said, "and that I'd missed it by being too careful about the wrong things." She stood with that for a long moment. Her hands on the railing were fully cold now. Her shoulder was approximately 3 inches from his shoulder. The ventilation unit to their left made a low, continuous sound that she'd stopped hearing within the first 2 minutes of being up here. "You didn't miss it," she said. He turned to look at her. "You didn't miss it," she said again, because it was worth saying twice. "You were late and you were overcomplicated about it, and you bought an entire 42-unit apartment building when a phone call would have done the job, but you didn't miss it." Something moved through his face that was not the almost smile or the assessment look or any of the controlled registers she'd cataloged over 3 years. It was something less managed and more real, the expression of a man who had been told something he needed to hear by someone he trusted. And the combination of those two things had reached a place that his professional architecture couldn't intercept. "I'll work on the phones," he said. "You should," she said. "They're significantly cheaper." He moved his hand on the railing, just slightly. Just enough that his hand covered hers, the way he'd done in the elevator with the steel rod. Careful, deliberate, a question that had the shape of a statement. She turned her hand over, palm up. His hand closed around it, warm against the cold of the railing and the cold of the evening. They stood like that for a while, looking at Seoul, the city that didn't care about any of this and kept moving anyway, enormous and indifferent and full of light. In the months that followed, the things that needed to settle, settled. Jinhwan's case moved through the legal architecture that Taehyuk's people had constructed for it, slowly, deliberately, with the kind of patience that complex cases require when you're trying to build something that will hold under any examination. The financial evidence Naomi had documented in those first weeks held. The testimony from Min Seok held. The container yard operation at the port of Busan generated its own evidentiary record that investigators with the right clearances spent considerable time working through. Jinhwan did not cooperate. This was not surprising. He sat in the legal proceedings with the same composure he'd shown in the container yard, and he said what he chose to say, and didn't say what he didn't, and the case proceeded around and without him as cases do when the evidence is sufficient. He was convicted on the financial charges in the 9th month. The operational charges followed in the 11th. He would be in a facility for a long time, which was the most direct way to say it, and the nature of the facility was one where his ability to direct external operations was genuinely constrained, which had required effort and care on several levels to arrange. Taehyuk visited him once after the sentencing. Naomi didn't ask what was said. She thought she knew the shape of it. Not a conversation that resolved anything, because some things don't resolve. They just become the thing you carry and eventually learn to carry without it stopping you. She thought about the photograph on Taehyuk's desk, the one she'd dusted around for 3 years. She didn't know if it was still there. She hadn't looked. Min Seok received what Naomi had come to think of as a considered outcome. Neither the full weight of everything he'd done, nor the clean slate that full cooperation sometimes fantasized as its reward. He was out of the organization. The financial consequences were significant. He had agreed to conditions that would make rebuilding anything like his former position impossible. She didn't have specific feelings about this. She had the understanding that he'd made choices for reasons that were his own, and that those reasons didn't neutralize the choices, and that the consequence had been proportionate to what she knew about how these things were determined. That was as far as she went. Choi was a harder thing to think about, not because his outcome was in any way ambiguous, it wasn't, but because of the 10 years and the particular texture of his betrayal, which was the kind that hollowed something out in the people around it. He had been in the room for a decade of decisions. The security protocols he'd helped design were the same ones he'd helped work around. She thought about how you rebuilt trust in a structure after that discovery, and then she looked at what she'd built over 4 months and thought, that's how. You build it in. You stop assuming trust is a given, and you build verification into the architecture, and you make the verification normal, routine, expected, so that the absence of a single trustworthy person doesn't make the whole thing fall. She wrote a note about this into the final section of the restructure documentation. It was the most personal thing in the whole document, not labeled as personal, just present, in the reasoning for one of the redundancy system's least obvious requirements. Park read it during the review process and looked up and said, "This is the Choi section." Naomi said yes. Park nodded and initialed it and moved on, which was the right response. The fountain in the courtyard ran all through the spring. Naomi heard it from her kitchen window on mornings when she was up early enough, which was most mornings. She had reclaimed the sleeping until 7 habit briefly after the port, but she was a morning person at her core, and the habit had lapsed back to 6:15 by the 3rd week. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window. She listened to the fountain and thought about Mrs. Kim's husband standing in the courtyard with his question, and the small weight of ordinary moments that keep their significance for decades, if you're lucky enough to have them and alive enough to remember them. The young mother across the hall had twins who had started calling Naomi Auntie sometime in February, which had happened without announcement or discussion, the way children made social decisions, efficiently and without apparent self-consciousness. She brought them cookies occasionally. They brought her drawings of varying abstract quality. She put the drawings on her refrigerator because that's what you did. Her mother came to visit in the spring. Diane Carter arrived with 2 large suitcases, one of which was primarily filled with things she'd decided Naomi needed that Naomi had not asked for, and a quality of assessment that she applied to the apartment, the building, the neighborhood, and eventually to Taehyuk, who came to dinner on the second evening of the visit, which had not been planned, which had happened because Naomi's mother had said, in the particular flat conversational register that was her most effective mode, "I'd like to meet him." And Taehyuk, when told, had said what time and shown up with the kind of food that reflected several days of quietly researched information about what the woman liked, which was the thing that made Diane Carter sit back at the table at the end of the evening and look at her daughter across the table with an expression that said many things without saying any of them. Later, after Taehyuk had gone and Naomi was cleaning up and her mother was sitting at the kitchen table with the last of the wine, Diane said, "He looked at you the whole time." "We were having a conversation," Naomi said. "Not a conversation look, the other kind." Diane set her glass down. "He looked at you the way your father looked at me before he learned other ways to look at me, and I'm not going to hold that against him because that's not his fault, and it's ancient history." She paused. "I'm saying he looks at you the way people do when they've decided something." Naomi stacked the plates. She considered what to say. "It's complicated," she said. "You said that on the phone." "It's still complicated." "Everything worth anything is complicated," Diane said. She picked up her glass again. "The question is whether the complicated is the problem or the relationship." Naomi thought about an apartment building purchased in 18 hours. About a name said with care, over and over, in rooms where the air was full of something that had never been said. About a hand on a railing in the dark, warm against cold, closing gently around hers like a question that already knew its answer. "It's the relationship," she said. Her mother nodded. She finished her wine. She looked at the window where the night outside was quiet and the fountain in the courtyard was still running because it was a mild spring and no one had turned it off yet. "Then figure out the rest," Diane said. "You're good at that." In the 7th month, Naomi moved her office to the 44th floor. Not into the executive wing. She had made that clear when she accepted the CSO role. She wanted her own space, separate from the operational command structure, in a way that preserved her ability to function as an independent check on the systems she'd built. Because a chief strategy officer who was too embedded in the decisions she was supposed to be auditing was a structural vulnerability, and she knew what structural vulnerabilities cost. Taehyuk had agreed without argument, which told her that he understood, which was one of the several things about him that she was still in the process of cataloging and had decided was probably an ongoing project rather than a completable one. Her office had a window that faced south, toward the river. She could see the Han from the right angle, which she'd verified before accepting the space, because if she was going to spend the rest of her professional life in this building, she was going to do it with a view of something that moved. She brought her own things. 3 framed prints, all abstract, in colors she'd picked years ago for a different apartment and never gotten rid of because they were hers. A small plant on the windowsill, her mother's idea, practical in the way good ideas often are, something alive to look at. Her own coffee setup because the executive floor kitchen made coffee that was objectively fine and subjectively wrong. She brought her legal pads. She always brought more legal pads than she needed, and she'd stopped being embarrassed about this. On the first morning in the new office, she sat at her desk and looked at the river through the south window and thought about where she'd been a year ago. In an apartment she loved, believing in a job she was good at, building a quiet life in a city that was large enough to get lost in if that was what you needed. She thought about the 2 a.m. phone call in the elevator and the pier and the container yard in the rain. She thought about the rod in her hands and the sound it made and the fact that she'd been able to do what she'd done when she needed to do it, which told her something about herself that she was still integrating. She was not the person she'd been before the 2 a.m. call. She knew that. She had lost something, the specific quality of innocence that comes from not knowing what you're working inside, the comfort of clean hands in a complicated world. And she was not going to pretend she hadn't. Some things don't come back. You figure out what to build in their place. She had built something. It was in the filing systems, and the authorization protocols, and the redundancy documentation, and the 2 people she'd hired who were currently doing excellent, careful work 3 floors down. It was in the cross-referenced legal pads she'd kept, all 6 of them, stored in a cabinet in her new office, because she'd decided they were important, and she was allowed to decide what was important now. She was building something else too. That one was slower, less architecturally precise, more like the work her mother did at the garden center, patient and seasonal, and conducted with the understanding that not everything blooms on a timeline you set yourself. She was learning to be okay with that. At 9:15, there was a knock at her office door. She'd put a nameplate on it, small, plain, her own name. She looked up. "Come in," she said. Taehyuk opened the door. He had 2 coffees, which was no longer a surprise, and an expression she knew now as the one he wore when he had something to say and was deciding how to say it, which was the expression he wore more often these days because he was saying things he hadn't said before, which was its own kind of progress. "The Northern Route reports," he said. "Park flagged an anomaly in the new monitoring system. First test of the redundancy protocol." Naomi felt her attention sharpen the way it did when something needed the specific kind of focus she was built for. "What kind of anomaly?" "Minor. Probably a calibration issue with the new access log parameters. But she wants your eyes on it before she closes the flag." "Send me the file." She reached for her coffee. "Give me an hour." He nodded. He set the second coffee on her desk. He looked at the south window, at the river in the morning light. "Good view," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I took it." He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning light came through the south window and fell across the desk and the legal pads and the small plant from her mother and all the ordinary equipment of a working life. And neither of them said anything for a moment because sometimes the moment didn't require it. Then she opened the flagged file and started reading. He turned and walked back to the door, and at the door he paused with his hand on the frame, not looking back, just pausing, the way you pause at the threshold of something when you're still getting used to the shape of it. Then he walked out and went back to work. And she stayed at her desk and went back to work. And in the building around them, the day moved forward in the unhurried way of days that have nothing catastrophic planned for them, which was ordinary and unremarkable and exactly enough.